For most of the war, defeat was a word that did not exist inside German headquarters. Losses could be explained, setbacks could be reframed, retreats could be renamed as strategic withdrawals. Even disasters were described as temporary reversals. What mattered was not what had happened, but what could still be imagined. Yet long before the final collapse, long before Berlin was encircled, something far more important began to disappear inside the German high command. Confidence. Not public confidence, not the speeches, not the communiques, but the private professional belief that war could still be shaped by decision and skill. This story is not about the day Germany surrendered. It is about the moment German generals understood that the war, as a contest they could still influence, was already over. The realization did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived quietly, in rooms filled with maps that no longer changed, in meetings where no one argued anymore, in calculations that produced the same answer no matter who checked them. By the time the truth became unavoidable, the war continued only because habit and obedience outlived belief. At the beginning, German generals had believed they were fighting a war of movement and decision. Speed, surprise, concentration of force, these were the principles they trusted. They had seen them work in Poland, in France, and in the opening months against the Soviet Union. Even when the war expanded, even when enemies multiplied, the assumption remained the same. If Germany could maintain operational superiority, the situation could be stabilized. But by the later years of the war, stabilization itself had become an illusion. Inside the German Army High Command, reports arrived daily from every front. Each one was factual, restrained, and professional. Losses listed, units withdrawn, equipment destroyed. None of this was unusual. War had always involved attrition. What changed was the scale, and more importantly, the imbalance. Generals noticed that losses were no longer temporary problems to be corrected. They were permanent conditions. Divisions returned from the front smaller than before, rebuilt with fewer men, fewer vehicles, fewer trained officers. Replacement units arrived late, under strength, and often poorly trained. Equipment lists grew shorter, not longer, and behind every report lay the same unspoken question: where would the next replacement come from? The answers, when examined honestly, were alarming. By this stage of the war, Germany was fighting enemies whose resources were not merely larger, but structurally superior. The Soviet Union had recovered from its early disasters and was now producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition in quantities German planners had never imagined possible. The Western Allies, especially the United States, brought industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could assemble, even under total mobilization. German generals understood numbers. They had been trained to think in terms of supply, reserves, and sustainability. And when they compared German capacity to that of their enemies, the conclusion was unavoidable. This was no longer a war of operational brilliance. It was a war of exhaustion, and Germany was the side being exhausted. Still, belief lingered longer than logic. Some hoped for technological breakthroughs. Others believed political fractures among the Allies might change the balance. A few clung to the idea that defensive warfare could inflict such heavy losses that the enemy would seek compromise. But these were hopes, not strategies. What truly disturbed many generals was not defeat on one front, but the pattern emerging across all fronts at once. In the East, Soviet forces no longer paused after victories. They advanced continuously, regrouping while moving forward, something that had once been unthinkable. In the West, Allied air power made daylight movement dangerous and supply lines fragile. In the air, German losses mounted faster than pilots could be trained. At sea, the situation was already beyond recovery. Each front alone might have been endured. Together, they formed a system of pressure that never relaxed. Inside staff meetings, language began to change. Early in the war, discussions focused on initiative and opportunity. Later, they focused on containment and delay. Eventually, even those words disappeared. Conversations became technical, narrow, almost mechanical. How long a position could be held, how much fuel remained, which unit could be moved without causing collapse elsewhere. No one needed to say what this meant. The generals had reached a stage where strategy was no longer about winning, but about slowing the rate of loss. That shift, more than any single battle, marked the true end. What made this realization particularly heavy was the knowledge that it could not be openly acknowledged. Adolf Hitler still demanded offensive spirit, unwavering resistance, and absolute obedience. He interpreted doubt as disloyalty and realism as defeatism. Generals who contradicted him were dismissed, sidelined, or ignored. Over time, many stopped arguing, not because they agreed, but because they understood the arguments no longer mattered. Orders continued to arrive, often disconnected from reality. Counterattacks were demanded where no reserves existed. Positions were ordered held where supply was impossible. Withdrawals were forbidden, even when encirclement was inevitable. German generals were trained to adapt, but adaptation requires freedom. What remained was execution without expectation. Privately, many officers began to understand something profoundly unsettling. The war was no longer being directed by military logic. It was being driven by will alone, and will, without means, could not change outcomes. This understanding did not produce immediate rebellion or refusal. The German officer corps was deeply shaped by obedience and duty, but it did produce something quieter and more corrosive: resignation. Men continued to work, to plan, to command, but without conviction. Decisions were made because they had to be made, not because they were believed in. Reports were written because they were required, not because anyone expected them to alter the course of events. The war continued in motion, but its center had already collapsed. This was the point at which German generals, as professionals, understood that the war was over, not in calendar time, but in substance. Victory was no longer a conceivable outcome. Even survival on acceptable terms was uncertain. What remained was the question of how the end would come and how much destruction would precede it. That question would shape every decision that followed. If there was one place where German generals first lost the ability to deceive themselves, it was the Eastern Front. Not because defeat came suddenly there, but because it arrived methodically, relentlessly, and without pause. In the early years of the war against the Soviet Union, German commanders had believed they were facing an enemy that could be shattered by decisive blows. Even after the failure to take Moscow, many assumed that the Red Army survived through desperation naturally than strength. Losses were immense, leadership uneven, and entire formations disappeared under German offensives. To trained German officers, it still looked like a war that could be managed. That perception did not survive the later phases of the conflict. By the time the war entered its middle years, German generals were no longer observing a collapsing opponent. They were watching an enemy that absorbed destruction and returned stronger. Soviet formations that had once disintegrated now regrouped quickly. Command structures improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support became increasingly effective. Most alarming of all was the scale. German intelligence officers compiled reports showing Soviet force concentrations that exceeded anything previously encountered. Entire armies appeared where German planners had expected exhausted remnants. When Soviet offensives stalled, they resumed not months later, but weeks later, often with fresh units. For German generals, this violated a basic assumption of warfare. Large-scale operations were supposed to require time to rebuild. The Red Army no longer followed that rule. Behind the front lines, Soviet industry had been reorganized beyond German reach. Factories relocated east of the Urals were producing tanks and artillery in numbers that German staff officers found difficult to accept at first. Losses that would have crippled Germany were being replaced by the Soviets almost automatically. German commanders began to realize that every successful defensive action merely delayed the inevitable. Tactical victories no longer changed the strategic balance. Even when German forces inflicted disproportionate casualties, the Red Army returned. The language used in situation reports reflected this shift. Earlier documents spoke of restoring lines and regaining initiative. Later ones spoke only of preventing breakthroughs and managing withdrawals. Even the most capable German field commanders could no longer propose operations that promised lasting results. The Eastern Front also destroyed another illusion, the idea that experience alone could compensate for material inferiority. German officers prided themselves on professionalism and adaptability. They had always believed that superior training could overcome numerical disadvantages. But the Soviet army they now faced was no longer inexperienced. Its officers had learned through brutal trial. Its command culture, while still rigid in some areas, had grown more effective at coordinating large formations. The Red Army was no longer improvising, it was executing. German generals noticed that Soviet offensives were now designed with depth. Initial attacks fixed German units in place. Secondary forces exploited weaknesses. Follow-up formations ensured that breakthroughs could not be sealed again. Encirclements became systematic rather than accidental. This was not the enemy Germany had prepared to fight. Perhaps most disturbing was the absence of strategic pauses. In earlier campaigns, German commanders had relied on the enemy's need to regroup. Winter, exhaustion, and logistical limits had once provided breathing space. Now, even after massive engagements, Soviet pressure resumed with minimal delay. There was no longer a rhythm to the war that Germany could exploit. Inside German headquarters, officers began comparing maps from different months. The front lines did not simply move back, they accelerated. Retreats covered greater distances in shorter periods of time. Positions that had taken months to defend collapsed in weeks, and every retreat carried consequences. Territory lost in the east was not empty land. It contained rail lines, resources, manpower, and depth. Each withdrawal shortened Germany's defensive space and increased the enemy's momentum. German generals understood the mathematics of this process. Defensive wars require space. Germany was running out of it. At the same time, the cost of holding the Eastern Front drained Germany's overall war effort. Units sent east were not available elsewhere. Equipment lost there could not be replaced. Fuel consumed there reduced operational capacity on other fronts. The Eastern Front was no longer just a theatre of war. It had become a gravitational force pulling Germany toward collapse. Privately, some generals began to admit what could not be said openly. The Soviet Union could no longer be defeated militarily, not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because the structural imbalance was overwhelming. This realization did not come as a single revelation. It formed gradually, through repeated exposure to the same outcome. Plan, resist, retreat. Plan again, resist again, retreat further. By the time senior commanders accepted this pattern, the war had already entered a new phase. Germany was no longer attempting to win in the East. It was attempting to survive it. But survival required time, and time was exactly what Germany no longer controlled. Every Soviet advance reduced Germany's options. Every destroyed unit narrowed the margin for maneuver. German generals found themselves making decisions not to gain advantage, but to avoid immediate catastrophe. This shift marked a fundamental change in mindset. A war that had once been about shaping events was now about reacting to them. German command had moved from initiative to response, from confidence to calculation, and calculation offered no optimism. By the end of this phase, many German generals understood something that would define the remainder of the war. Even if every remaining reserve were committed, even if every position were held as long as possible, the Eastern Front would not stabilize. It would only delay the collapse. The war was no longer unwinnable because of a single defeat. It was unwinnable because the enemy could not be stopped. And this knowledge, once accepted, spread quietly through the high command. The Eastern Front had not just broken German armies, it had broken the belief that effort alone could change destiny. While the Eastern Front destroyed Germany's belief in endurance, the Western Front destroyed its belief in balance. For German generals, this realization was perhaps even more unsettling, because it confirmed that there was no safe direction left to turn. For years, German planning had assumed that the decisive struggle would take place in the East. The West, though dangerous, was seen as manageable. Britain had survived, but could not strike decisively alone. The United States, many believed, would require time to mobilize and experience to become effective. Even after American entry into the war, German officers expected a period of adjustment. That period never truly came. By the time Allied forces began returning to the European continent in strength, German generals were already confronting a level of coordination and material superiority that exceeded their expectations. The Western Allies did not simply arrive with troops, they arrived with an entire system of war. From the first major engagements, German commanders noticed something deeply troubling. Allied operations were not constrained by the shortages that dominated German planning. When German units lost vehicles or artillery, replacements were uncertain. When Allied units suffered losses, they were restored quickly, often at full strength. This was not just a difference in resources, it was a difference in tempo. German generals had been trained to exploit moments of weakness, but the Western Allies offered very few. Their logistics functioned with a reliability that German officers could not disrupt consistently. Rail lines were repaired, ports expanded rapidly, supplies flowed forward without interruption. For the first time, German commanders faced an enemy that could sustain continuous pressure without exhausting itself. Air power amplified this imbalance. German officers had understood air superiority as a tactical advantage. What they now confronted was something else entirely. Allied air forces shaped the battlefield before ground troops even moved. Rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and communication nodes were struck systematically. Movement in daylight became hazardous. Supply columns were forced to travel at night, reducing efficiency. Commanders could no longer shift reserves freely without risking destruction from the air. The effect on German decision-making was profound. Operations that might have been feasible on paper became impossible in practice. Reinforcing one sector meant weakening another, and even then, movement itself carried unacceptable risk. Defensive lines existed only as long as they could be supplied, and supply was increasingly unreliable. German generals recognized a cruel irony. Even when the Western Allies advanced cautiously, even when they paused to consolidate, the pressure did not ease. Their material advantage meant that time worked in their favor. Every delay strengthened them and weakened Germany. This reversed a principle German commanders had relied on throughout the war. Time had once favored Germany's operational agility. Now, time belonged entirely to the enemy. Perhaps the most devastating realization came when German officers compared their situation in the West to that in the East. They were no longer choosing between threats. They were being compressed by them. Reserves transferred west weakened the Eastern Front. Units sent east left the West exposed. There was no longer a correct decision, only a less disastrous one. This strategic trap was fully understood by senior commanders. They also recognized something even more alarming. The Western Allies were not fighting alone. They coordinated their efforts with the Soviet Union, even if imperfectly. German hopes that tensions between the Allies might limit cooperation began to fade as operations increasingly converged in time and effect. Germany was being attacked not just from multiple directions, but with a shared purpose. Inside German headquarters, discussions became increasingly constrained. Long-term planning disappeared. Instead, meetings focused on immediate threats and emergency responses. Commanders spoke less about campaigns and more about sectors. The scope of decision-making narrowed with each month. Language again revealed the truth. Offensive concepts vanished. Even the word counterattack was used cautiously. The emphasis shifted to holding key terrain, protecting lines of communication, and preventing breakthroughs that could lead to rapid collapse. German generals understood that the Western Front represented more than another battlefield. It represented confirmation that the industrial and logistical imbalance was total. The United States, in particular, embodied a scale of production that German planners could not match or disrupt. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition appeared in numbers that made individual German successes irrelevant. Destroying an Allied unit no longer changed the balance. It merely delayed the next one. This realization affected morale at the highest levels, not in dramatic expressions of despair, but in subtle changes of behavior. Fewer objections were raised in meetings. Fewer alternative plans were proposed. Officers focused on execution rather than innovation. Professional pride remained, but optimism did not. By this stage, German generals had accepted a grim conclusion. Germany was now fighting enemies who could replace everything they lost, while Germany could not replace what it was losing. This asymmetry defined the remainder of the war. Even if Germany could hold a line temporarily, even if it could inflict heavy casualties, the strategic outcome would not change. The Western Allies would return stronger, Germany would return weaker. This was not a judgment born of emotion, it was a calculation. And once that calculation was made, strategic hope disappeared. The war continued, but the belief that it could be shaped by German decision-making did not. There comes a point in every lost war when faith gives way to arithmetic. For German generals, this moment did not arrive through ideology or fear, but through numbers that could no longer be argued away. German officers were trained to trust calculations. Supply tables, replacement rates, fuel consumption, and production figures were not abstractions. They were the foundations of planning. Early in the war, these figures had supported confidence. Later, they destroyed it. By the middle stages of the conflict, staff officers began compiling comparisons that revealed an unbridgeable gap. Losses were no longer temporary fluctuations. They formed patterns that repeated month after month. Tank losses exceeded production. Aircraft losses exceeded training capacity. Artillery ammunition consumption outpaced manufacturing. Fuel stocks declined regardless of conservation efforts. Every attempt to compensate only shifted the deficit elsewhere. German generals understood that war was not won by isolated victories, but by sustained capability. And sustained capability was no longer possible. One of the most sobering realizations concerned replacement quality. Early in the war, German losses had been replaced by trained soldiers drawn from a large pool. By the later years, replacements arrived younger, less trained, and increasingly inexperienced. Veteran units became diluted, command cohesion weakened. This decline was not due to a lack of discipline. It was the result of exhaustion. German generals compared reports from different years and saw the difference immediately. Units that once executed complex maneuvers now struggled with basic coordination. Maintenance backlogs increased. Equipment was cannibalized to keep a few vehicles operational. The numbers told a clear story. Germany was consuming its military capital faster than it could regenerate it. Fuel shortages were particularly revealing. Operations that required speed and flexibility were now constrained by limited movement. Training hours were cut, air sorties were reduced, even basic reconnaissance became difficult. German officers recognized that fuel was not just a logistical issue, it was a strategic limiter. Without it, maneuver warfare was impossible. Defense became static, initiative vanished. At the same time, enemy production figures continued to rise. Allied aircraft production alone exceeded German capacity by a margin that eliminated any realistic hope of regaining air parity. Soviet armored output dwarfed German replacement rates even during periods of intense German resistance. These comparisons were not propaganda. They came from intelligence estimates, captured documents, and direct observation. German generals trusted them because they matched what they saw at the front. Every calculation ended the same way. There was no scenario in which Germany could restore balance. Some officers attempted to imagine extreme solutions: total mobilization, drastic reductions in civilian consumption, radical reallocations of resources. But even these measures, when quantified, fell short. The problem was not efficiency, it was scale. German industry had been pushed to its limits. Factories worked under constant threat of air attack. Skilled labor declined as casualties mounted. Transportation networks deteriorated. No further optimization could overcome the fundamental disparity. This realization marked a turning point in mindset. Earlier in the war, setbacks had inspired urgency and innovation. Now they inspired resignation. Officers continued to produce plans, but those plans were increasingly defensive, narrow, and temporary. Long-term projections disappeared from serious discussion. They were replaced by questions of days and weeks. How long could this position hold? How many units could be moved before collapse? How much fuel remained? German generals were no longer managing a campaign, they were managing decline. The most striking change was psychological. Numbers removed the possibility of self-deception. Courage could not alter production ratios. Discipline could not create fuel. Experience could not replace destroyed divisions. For professional soldiers trained to believe that skill mattered, this was devastating. It also changed the relationship between the generals and Adolf Hitler. Hitler continued to issue orders based on will and belief. Generals now evaluated those orders through arithmetic. When orders demanded operations that exceeded available means, generals no longer argued passionately. They noted the impossibility internally and executed what they could. Obedience remained, but conviction did not. This shift created a quiet separation between command and control. Orders flowed downward, reality flowed upward. They no longer met. The war continued because the system demanded it, not because the outcome was in doubt. By this stage, German generals had crossed a psychological threshold. They were no longer asking whether Germany could win. They were asking how long the war could be prolonged before total collapse. Numbers had replaced belief, and numbers showed no mercy. Meetings that spoke without words. By the later years of the war, the German High Command had become a theatre of unspoken truths. Officially, meetings were held to plan operations, coordinate units, and issue instructions. Unofficially, they were gatherings where generals measured each other's silence, gauged hesitation, and recognized the limits of what could be achieved. Inside these rooms, the language had subtly shifted. Early in the war, conversations brimmed with strategy, ideas, and contingency planning. Officers debated movements, opportunities, and potential victories. Optimism was not merely tolerated, it was expected. Now the focus had narrowed. Discussions revolved around what could be delayed, what could be preserved, and how collapse could be minimized. The walls did not absorb despair, but the air inside them carried the weight of recognition. Generals exchanged reports with a calm, almost clinical tone. Casual observations of enemy strength, unit depletion, and logistical constraints were recorded as if describing abstract numbers rather than forces composed of men. Yet behind these formal reports lay the silent understanding. These numbers spelled the end. Hitler's presence in meetings complicated the situation. His expectations were unyielding. He demanded offensive spirit even when offensive operations were impossible. He required defense even when positions could not be held. Questioning orders was dangerous, yet obeying them meant executing actions that could not succeed. Generals quickly learned to navigate these constraints. They ceased challenging reality openly. Instead, they focused on procedural compliance, offering tactical options that technically fulfilled directives without pretending they could change the strategic outcome. Words became a form of camouflage. Silence, glances, and hesitations conveyed truth. For those accustomed to relying on initiative, this was disorienting. The high command meetings had once been arenas of decision and influence. Now, they were spaces where the professional understanding of defeat existed but could not be spoken. Every word had to be filtered through the lens of obedience, yet every mind comprehended the same grim reality. Some officers attempted subtle signaling, a pause here, a carefully worded report there, each designed to indicate limits without openly defying orders. Others withdrew entirely into numbers, maps, and calculations. Strategy became mechanical. The human element, the judgment that had once defined German operational effectiveness, receded. The pattern of these meetings reflected a broader change in German military culture. Initiative was no longer rewarded. Realism was dangerous. Conformity ensured survival. Yet behind compliance, the general's awareness of inevitable defeat shaped every decision. Even victories were hollow. A successful defensive action or a minor tactical gain did not restore confidence. Instead, it highlighted the impossibility of reversing the strategic trajectory. Every gain was temporary. Every loss absorbed into an irreversible decline. Generals began to calculate not how to win, but how to extend the duration of resistance, minimize casualties, and preserve what remained for as long as possible. This subtle resignation was visible to those who looked closely. Officers avoided eye contact when discussing impossible tasks. Reports were delivered with mechanical precision, stripped of any indication of hope or emotion. Commands were repeated, executed, and recorded, yet everyone present understood the futility behind them. In this environment, the notion of surrender was unspoken, but omnipresent. The generals did not actively seek it. They did not openly advocate for it, but the concept shaped their thinking, guiding decisions and influencing priorities. Every strategic choice, every movement of troops, every allocation of limited resources was informed by the silent acknowledgement that Germany's capacity to continue the war was steadily eroding. The high command meetings thus became a microcosm of the broader German war effort. On the surface, activity continued. Plans were made, orders were given, reports were filed. Beneath the surface, belief in victory had evaporated. What remained was discipline, duty, and the quiet calculation of survival. By observing these meetings, historians can trace the transition from active command to procedural maintenance. The generals' faces, their tones, and their careful wording reveal the slow but inexorable recognition that the war could no longer be won, only endured. It was within these rooms that the psychological surrender occurred long before any formal capitulation. The generals' understanding of defeat existed simultaneously with the continuation of operations. They carried the burden of knowing the outcome while maintaining the facade of authority and competence. This duality, the coexistence of obedience and resignation, defined the final phase of the German command structure. It shaped every operational decision, influenced every defensive maneuver, and set the stage for the inevitable collapse. By the end of these meetings, a clear pattern emerged. Germany's military was no longer an instrument of potential victory. It had become a mechanism for delaying defeat, preserving resources, and managing the unavoidable. The moment the generals recognized this, the war had already ended for them, even if it continued in the field. Words shape reality. For German generals, the slow decay of their language reflected the collapse of their strategic world. Early in the war, language was expansive, filled with terms like offensive, counterattack, initiative, and decisive maneuver. Each word carried both a technical and emotional weight. They conveyed purpose, possibility, and control. By the later stages of the conflict, these terms vanished. They were replaced by words of limitation: delay, contain, withdrawal, holding action. The shift was subtle yet profound. It did not occur in speeches or public statements, which continued to employ triumphalist rhetoric. It occurred in staff reports, planning documents, and the private conversations of generals. Language, once a tool of ambition, became a mirror of necessity. The disappearance of offensive vocabulary reflected a deeper reality. The German military no longer possessed the freedom to seize opportunity. Each action was constrained by shortages of men, equipment, and fuel. Each decision was measured not by its potential for success, but by its capacity to prevent catastrophic failure. Generals adapted. They substituted one word for another, carefully crafting terminology that acknowledged limitations without exposing despair. Counteroffensive became local countermeasures. Advance became positional adjustments. Even defense was qualified by modifiers indicating temporary retention or delay. These linguistic changes were not bureaucratic trivialities. They reflected the mindset of commanders who had internalized defeat without uttering it aloud. The effect on operational culture was profound. When words for initiative and victory disappeared, so too did the mindset that accompanied them. Officers no longer conceived of operations as instruments to shape the battlefield in their favor. Instead, they viewed every maneuver as a reaction to enemy action, an attempt to mitigate loss rather than create advantage. This shift was compounded by Hitler's unyielding directives. He demanded offensive spirit and refused to acknowledge setbacks. Generals, bound by duty and the risk of dismissal, learned to comply while understanding the impossibility of success. Language became a mechanism for navigating this tension. Words masked futility while preserving appearances. Reports from the front reflected this change. Earlier dispatches emphasized achievements, positions regained, and enemy losses inflicted. Later dispatches enumerated delays, attrition rates, and retreat distances. Tactical terminology survived, but strategic ambition had been excised. Commanders quantified survival rather than victory. In staff meetings, this collapse of strategic language manifested in the way problems were discussed. Discussions of potential campaigns were replaced by debates over how long a line could be held, how to redistribute depleted units, or how to maintain communication under constant threat. Officers no longer proposed maneuvers designed to gain advantage. They proposed methods to slow decline. The psychological effect on the high command was cumulative. Confidence, once reinforced by vocabulary that implied control, diminished as words reflected constraints. Generals internalized the limitations, and the absence of terms for initiative became a self-fulfilling prophecy. With language stripped of hope, decisions followed the same pattern: cautious, defensive, and constrained. Even the language of encouragement changed. Orders meant to inspire troops became formulaic. Phrases emphasizing endurance or duty replaced discussions of tactics or opportunity. The emotional content of commands eroded alongside strategic optimism. Soldiers at the front received directives that emphasized survival over success, compliance over creativity. The collapse of strategic language also affected interaction with subordinate officers. Younger commanders, trained to innovate and take initiative, found their vocabulary and options restricted. They were required to report in terms that matched the high command's constrained mindset, further reinforcing the culture of limitation. Creativity became dangerous, not impossible, because it challenged the linguistic framework imposed by necessity. Ultimately, the erosion of language mirrored the erosion of belief. When generals could no longer speak of winning, they could no longer plan to win. Operations continued, but the center of gravity had shifted from ambition to containment. Every plan, every order, every calculation was informed by the unspoken acknowledgement that Germany's capacity for decisive action had vanished. This linguistic transformation was not accidental. It was the manifestation of a broader systemic collapse. Without the vocabulary of initiative, the German military could not conceive victory, even when isolated tactical opportunities arose. Obedience persisted, discipline persisted, but the guiding framework of command, the belief in the possibility of shaping outcomes, had disappeared. By understanding this, historians can trace the invisible process through which the German war effort transitioned from active engagement to managed decline. The general's recognition of defeat was not sudden. It arrived gradually, codified in reports, discussions, and the subtle changes of language. Words that once promised movement, opportunity, and success now marked the limits of endurance. In effect, the high command had already surrendered before the front lines collapsed. The war continued outwardly, but inside the rooms where strategy had once been conceived, defeat was fully comprehended. Language had become both symptom and instrument of this understanding, and in this quiet shift, the moment of irreversible strategic recognition was complete. Numbers, reports, and strategic language revealed the impossibility of victory, but the general's recognition of defeat carried a deeper human dimension, the moral breaking point. It was one thing to understand defeat analytically. It was another to reconcile that understanding with the lives of the men under one's command. By late 1944, German officers confronted a grim reality. Millions of soldiers were engaged in operations that could no longer produce meaningful outcomes. Each defensive line held temporarily, each counterattack executed, inflicted casualties that could never be replaced. Every advance or retreat cost lives that were, from a strategic perspective, wasted. This recognition weighed heavily on professional soldiers who had built their careers on competence and responsibility. They were trained to minimize unnecessary loss and to exploit advantage. Yet now, all their expertise only slowed the inevitable. Their efforts no longer served victory, they merely postponed collapse. The moral burden was amplified by the impact on civilians. Cities in the east had been devastated by repeated retreats and bombardments. Refugees crowded railways and roads. Infrastructure was destroyed. Generals understood that every day the front held meant more suffering for the population they nominally protected. The equation of war had expanded beyond the battlefield. Every calculation carried moral consequences. Some officers internalized this burden quietly. They worked late into the night, reviewing logistics, calculating how long positions could be maintained, and making decisions about which units to sacrifice to delay enemy progress. Others sought escape in procedure. Reports, tables, and orders became the focus, substituting action for reflection. A mechanical rhythm replaced deliberation, yet the weight of awareness remained. The breaking point also revealed itself in subtle behaviors during meetings. Hesitation before speaking, avoidance of eye contact, and carefully measured tones became indicators of the inner struggle. Officers no longer needed to voice despair. It was visible in the tension and restraint of their interactions. Silence carried as much meaning as words. At the front, the moral crisis manifested in the way orders were executed. Units continued to fight, but increasingly, decisions were defensive, cautious, and aimed at survival. Ambition was replaced by preservation. Soldiers followed orders because discipline dictated it, but initiative and innovation, the qualities that had once defined German combat, were fading. The moral dimension intertwined with the psychological one. Generals faced the knowledge that every decision contributed to a trajectory that could not be altered. Their duty demanded action, yet action itself perpetuated inevitable loss. The conflict between professional responsibility and the futility of their position created a quiet but pervasive despair. Some officers sought solace in adherence to rules, codes, and traditions. Military culture emphasized obedience, honor, and the chain of command. These structures provided a framework that allowed decision-making to continue, even when the rationale for those decisions was morally ambiguous. The rules of war became a refuge in an environment where victory was impossible. Others attempted to rationalize temporary tactical success as meaningful, clinging to small achievements to sustain morale. A defensive line held for a few days, an enemy counterattack repelled, a supply route maintained. Each minor accomplishment was elevated in significance, not because it changed the strategic picture, but because it allowed the human mind to endure. Yet even these small victories could not obscure the larger truth. The moral breaking point was inescapable because it existed not in the external world, but in the inner recognition of futility. Every calculation, every plan, every order carried the knowledge that Germany's capacity for success had vanished. By the end of this phase, the generals had internalized the same conclusion, silently and collectively. There was no debate, no argument, no remaining hope that the strategic trajectory could be reversed. Survival, mitigation, and delay were all that remained. This internalization shaped the remainder of the war effort. Decisions were constrained not only by material realities, but by moral awareness. Officers acted within the bounds of their understanding of loss, aware that their choices would influence the lives of countless men and civilians, yet powerless to change the ultimate outcome. The moral breaking point, then, was inseparable from strategic and psychological recognition. It marked the stage at which professional soldiers fully comprehended the cost of continuation and the impossibility of victory. From this point onward, the German High Command operated with a clear, if grim, understanding. The war could no longer be won, and every action henceforth was measured against the inevitability of defeat. In this sense, the moral breaking point was the quiet pivot of history. While operations continued and battles were fought, the war had already ended in the minds of those responsible for its conduct. The general's awareness of futility guided every decision, shaping the final acts of a collapsing military machine. By the last months of the conflict, German generals no longer debated strategy. They no longer imagined scenarios of reversal or salvation. The war had been stripped of all potential for victory. What remained was the management of collapse, the maintenance of units as long as possible, and the calculation of human cost. This final recognition did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It was the culmination of years of observation, calculation, and moral reckoning. Each failed offensive, each retreat, each logistical impossibility had built upon the last, layering awareness until there was no room for doubt. The generals understood that they were no longer the arbiters of outcomes. They were stewards of inevitability. In practical terms, this understanding shaped every operational decision. Orders were crafted with an eye toward delay rather than success. Defensive lines were reinforced selectively, prioritizing units that could hold longest. Retreats were executed in a manner that preserved remaining combat power for as long as feasible. Every allocation of resources was governed by the knowledge that the outcome was already determined. The psychological transformation within the high command was complete. Obedience persisted, but conviction did not. Officers executed directives with precision, but their hearts and minds acknowledged the futility of their actions. This duality, compliance without belief, defined the final months of German military conduct. Maps, once filled with bold arrows indicating planned advances and maneuvers, now displayed positions marked for temporary retention or controlled withdrawal. Reports quantified losses, remaining strength, and logistical gaps, rather than outlining bold strategies. Language itself confirmed the transformation. Terms of initiative had vanished, replaced by terms of endurance and limitation. The generals' awareness also influenced their interactions with Hitler. As the strategic reality became undeniable, dissent became increasingly subtle. Obedience remained outwardly complete, but internal assessments, recorded calculations, and private counsel reflected the true state of affairs. The divide between command directives and operational reality widened, but the knowledge within the high command converged on a single understanding. Germany's ability to influence the outcome of the war had ended. This recognition had tangible effects on troop deployment and planning. Defensive operations became compartmentalized, with the intent to hold lines temporarily rather than decisively. Counterattacks were undertaken only where absolutely necessary, and often with diminished resources. Logistical prioritization favored the most critical sectors, reflecting the general's awareness that total victory was unattainable. Every movement was constrained by both material scarcity and strategic futility. The moral dimension remained intertwined with operational calculations. Officers understood that every order executed would cost lives, and that these lives could not change the trajectory of the conflict. They acted with professionalism, discipline, and diligence, but always within the framework of inevitable defeat. The responsibility for those under command weighed heavily, and each decision required the careful balancing of survival, duty, and ethical consideration. By the time the front lines approached the German homeland, the war existed largely as a formality. Combat continued, but the generals had already acknowledged its outcome. Victory was no longer conceivable. Survival was precarious. The distinction between managing the war and shaping it had disappeared entirely. The final months highlighted the contrast between expectation and reality. Orders continued to flow from Berlin, often reflecting outdated assumptions or impossible ambitions. Field commanders adapted silently, modifying execution to align with operational limits. Every adaptation reflected the general's internal understanding. The war's direction was fixed, and Germany was on the path to inevitable defeat. Ultimately, this recognition was the most profound act of command in the later stages of the war. The general's comprehension of strategic collapse allowed them to manage resources, preserve units, and delay the full extent of destruction for as long as possible. Their awareness, disciplined and sober, became the guiding force behind every remaining decision. The war, in its essence, ended not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who had once directed it. German generals understood that the outcome was fixed, that resistance continued only through habit, obedience, and discipline. They carried the knowledge of defeat quietly, shaping every action in its shadow. In this sense, the moment German generals truly understood that the war was over represents a pivotal historical insight. It demonstrates that wars are not always defined by their final battles or formal surrender, but by the recognition of inevitability among those who direct them. Germany continued to fight, but the High Command had already conceded the contest. And in this quiet acknowledgement, the story of the war's end in command concludes. Victory had become impossible, defeat unavoidable, and the professional understanding of that truth defined the final chapter of Germany's military history.